No yelling, no aggression, just one quiet sentence that made an underworld boss lose all control. Brandon thought he owned the room, mocking her hidden pregnancy and demanding answers. Until Colton Hale appeared out of nowhere, stood by her side, and calmly stated the situation had everything to do with him. This is the most satisfying power shift, proving true authority doesn't need to shout to silence a room. The doors parted in absolute silence, a vacuum sealing away the outside world. Let us open this file together, you and I, and examine the subject. We will call her Maddie. She stepped into the heavy, climate-controlled air of the boutique, her hand instinctively guarding her ribs. Beneath her dark, structured coat, the undeniable physical reality of an 8-month pregnancy pressed forward. In clinical terms, we see a subject displaying classical avoidance behavior, attempting to camouflage a profound vulnerability. She carried the scent of polished wood and expensive leather in her lungs, yet her physical responses indicated acute stress. This was a sanctuary for the elite, but to her, it was a high-risk environment. She had escaped, yet still carried his genetic legacy. This particular environment was not designed for maternal bonding. It was an incubator for dynastic power, where bloodlines were solidified long before a first breath was drawn. Maddie had spent months isolating herself from this exact sociological framework. She had attempted a complete psychological detachment from their quiet violence, convincing herself she could construct a safe, invisible life, but human biology is a powerful motivator. There were logistical necessities she could no longer ignore. In the criminal networks I analyze, even purchasing an infant blanket carries immense risk. Her fingers gripped the fabric. A simple, meaningful truth applies here: we can never truly outrun our past when we carry its consequences with us. Our survival requires facing it. Notice her gross motor functions. She did not rush. She suppressed the biological urge to visually scan the perimeter for threats. In this apex predator hierarchy, projecting uncertainty is the equivalent of bleeding in open water. Weakness is never pitied by pathological personalities. It is catalogued and weaponized. Historically, she moved through these spaces with the blind confidence of the assimilated. She once believed their promises of loyalty were genuine, a common cognitive distortion in trauma victims. Now, her behavioral baseline had shifted. She had learned the agonizing cost of visibility. A woman behind the counter evaluated her with a fleeting, sterilized gaze, specifically trained to avoid unsolicited inquiry. She was surrounded by the machinery of total power. Institutional omerta operates on unspoken parameters. You do not ask about the genetic origin of the offspring. You simply observe, record, and report to the dominant figurehead when it serves your survival. Maddie registered the environmental shift immediately. It was not an overt auditory cue, but a sudden, suffocating density in the room. Her situational awareness spiked. Someone was watching. Someone always observes the anomaly. In a fascinating display of parasympathetic control, she forced her heart rate to decelerate. Panic triggers a predatory response. Absolute stillness mimics invisibility. She drifted toward a display of reinforced wooden cribs. These were not beds for infants. They were fortified structural units, armored compartments designed for absolute protection. In the taxonomy of organized crime, a biological heir is not merely a child, they are a geopolitical asset, a moving piece on a chessboard governed by sociopaths. Her hand hovered over the smooth barricade of the crib. This fetal development was a secret capable of destabilizing an entire syndicate. This is the root cause of her self-imposed exile. The underground network functions on absolute control. It ruthlessly purges unverified variables. If the alpha male discovered this unauthorized pregnancy, the threat matrix would extend far beyond her own mortality. It would necessitate a complete eradication of her autonomy. Her throat tightened, triggering a micro-expression of sheer terror, but her facial muscles immediately locked back into a mask of clinical, unreadable apathy. She had successfully conditioned herself to internalize her panic responses. The fear remained, festering beneath layers of extreme emotional suppression and psychological armor. Watch how her hands operate independently of her conscious mind, subtly adjusting the heavy fabric to obscure her abdomen. It is an instinctual shielding maneuver. She moved through this high-stakes environment in total isolation, not through abandonment, but through a rigorous risk-benefit analysis. She understood that in a world ruled by narcissistic abusers, extending trust is a form of self-sabotage. Placing faith in a compromised individual does not just cause emotional distress. It annihilates your capacity to survive. A child of this magnitude demands a mother who assumes everyone is an executioner. For a fraction of a second, the clinical detachment cracked. She allowed her respiratory rate to stabilize, her palm pressing flush against the concealed curve of her womb. "I have got you," she murmured in the absolute quiet of her own mind, terrified that spoken syllables could be intercepted. Paranoia is the baseline in this habitat. Then the auditory trigger occurred. You and I must pay close attention to this moment. It was not a chaotic noise, but a low, vibrating chuckle that instantly hijacked the room. Maddie experienced an involuntary nervous system freeze. Her fingers paralyzed against the crib. Respiration ceased entirely. This was the deep, neurological paralysis of a victim, hearing the exact pitch and cadence of their primary psychological tormentor. She did not rotate her cervical spine to visually confirm the threat. The auditory input was sufficient. That specific vocal signature had once deeply infected her subconscious, a hallmark of the severe trauma bond she had developed with her captor. Now it echoed through the pristine boutique like an unresolved pathology. Moving with the heavy, deliberate mechanics of a hostage, she elevated her chin. Her gaze tracked toward the perimeter. Brandon Morty occupied the space as if he owned the oxygen within it. He was the quintessential megalomaniac narcissist, draped in tailored black, projecting a terrifyingly calm dominance. His posture broadcasted absolute impunity. He understood that no organism in that structure could challenge his authority without suffering fatal consequence. Yet, an apex predator rarely hunts without a carefully selected extension of his ego. Savannah Verley stood anchored to his forearm. We must view Savannah not as a mere companion, but as a highly calculated behavioral prop. She positioned her physical mass in the space with the precision of a scalpel sliding under the skin. Her presentation was flawlessly engineered to inflict feelings of inadequacy, radiating generational wealth and ruthless alliances. Maddie felt the atmospheric frick pressure instantly compress her lungs. The claustrophobia of her previous captivity rushed back, flooding her brain with cortisol. The evolutionary mandate was screaming at her prefrontal cortex. Flee, disappear, evacuate the grid before his ocular focus locked onto her spatial coordinates. But the universe rarely accommodates the trauma survivor's need for a clean exit. Savannah initiated the visual sweep, her eyes acting as sensory radar until they snagged on Maddie. The recognition was instantaneous, lacking any human empathy. Instead, Savannah's facial muscles stretched into a slow, deliberate smile, signaling the dopamine hit of a predator discovering an unprotected vulnerability. "Well," she projected, her tone smooth but laced with distinct sociopathic undertones. This is unexpected. The decibel level was minimal, yet it saturated the acoustic environment. It commanded the immediate, terrified attention of every bystander in the room. When individuals with severe antisocial traits speak your name, they are not addressing you. They are establishing jurisdiction. The acoustic shift triggered Brandon to alter his physical orientation. His initial facial baseline was neutral, practically bored, but the millisecond his optical receptors processed Maddie's face, his entire cognitive state fractured. I want you to observe this transition with me. It was not mere surprise, it was the icy, rapid computation of a man whose absolute control had just been subverted. His visual focus plummeted downward, magnetically pulled toward the physical evidence she had so desperately tried to camouflage. Time dilated for the subject. Realization mutated his expression, rendering him momentarily unmoored. Maddie maintained direct eye contact, refusing to submit to the immense psychological gravity of the confrontation she had spent 8 months dreading. The illusion of her safety had catastrophically expired. Brandon advanced a single, measured pace. He exhibited no overt hostility, moving instead with the lethal calibration of an engineer analyzing a structural failure. When his vocal cords vibrated with her name, the acoustic output was disturbingly suppressed. Maddie. It functioned not as a standard social greeting, but as a proprietary claim. A leash being violently yanked back into his grip. The sterile luxury of the boutique instantly dissolved, transforming the architecture into an arena for profound psychological warfare. Beneath her rigid, emotionless exterior, a devastating neurological acceptance settled over her. The biological evidence of his dominion could no longer be classified as a secure, hidden variable. Notice the secondary antagonist's restraint. Savannah did not accelerate her movements or elevate her pitch. Female figures integrated into these high-threat syndicates learn early that true influence is about manipulating the temporal pacing. She stepped inward with a terrifying elegance, her footwear generating zero acoustic friction against the marble. It was a deliberate performance, telegraphing to the subjugated audience that a critical execution of power was underway. Her gaze remained surgically fixed on Maddie. There was an absolute absence of maternal solidarity or human warmth. Savannah's optical assessment was strictly clinical, dissecting Maddie with the cold precision of a jeweler, identifying a fatal inclusion in a piece of previously discarded property. I have interviewed some of the most dangerous minds in the prison system, and psychological violence almost always starts with a whisper. Savannah claimed she did not recognize Maddie, her voice soft but weaponized to grab the room's attention. The surrounding chatter died immediately. "You look different," Savannah added, leaving an intentional pause designed for maximum cruelty. Maddie felt the atmospheric pressure drop as unseen witnesses gathered to watch the dominance display. Meanwhile, Brandon simply stared. His gaze lacked normal human empathy. It was pure calculation. Like any classic megalomaniac narcissist, he was struggling to process a target who no longer fit the twisted reality he had carefully constructed. Brandon lowered his gaze, his eyes tracing with deliberate slowness over the curve of Maddie's coat. She tried to hide her pregnancy, but predators always lock onto vulnerabilities. The silence stretched until it became clinically suffocating. Savannah tilted her head, offering a hollow smile that bypassed her eyes. 8 months, she asked, her voice dripping with sadistic amusement. Or are you closer than that? This question was a severe psychological intrusion, deeply violating by design. It shattered Maddie's boundaries. signaling to the room that she was being publicly exposed. We see this tactic in organized crime constantly. Public unveiling is weaponized to traumatize the target so deeply they forget they even have the basic human right to defend themselves. A quiet murmur rippled through the boutique, moving like smoke through a cell block. Maddie tightened her grip on her coat, but her expression remained completely neutral. You and I need to look closely at this reaction. Maddie was displaying a classic trauma adaptation. She learned how to disassociate, standing perfectly still while being emotionally vivisected. "It is none of your concern," she stated, her voice remarkably steady. Savannah only smiled wider, feeding on the resistance. "Everything in this world becomes someone's concerns eventually," she replied. She glanced around the room, a space built solely to maintain elite bloodlines. The Nation was an accomplice, reminding Maddie that in their specific ecosystem, personal independence is always brutally punished. Brandon exhaled sharply, leaking an involuntary sign of deep psychological tension. When he spoke, his careful veneer was gone, replaced by something raw and hostile. "You did not tell anyone," he accused, his stare locking onto her with possessive obsession. "You disappear for months and then show up like this." The unfinished sentence hung in the air like a physical threat. Maddie felt the crushing weight of his words, not out of actual guilt, but because she recognized his behavioral loop. He was masterfully twisting her attempt at survival into a malicious betrayal, making her silence feel like a crime. In the past, this exact mechanism of Stockholm Syndrome would have broken her spirit entirely, forcing her to apologize to her abuser just for saving her own life. But it did not break her anymore. Savannah invaded Maddie's personal space, deploying her expensive perfume as a sensory trigger in Shenation V. Manipulators frequently use physical proximity to anchor anxiety. "You know how this looks, do you not?" Savannah murmured. Her tone was deceptively intimate, carefully modulated to broadcast. A hidden pregnancy, no announcement, no name attached in our world. Savannah's eyes gleamed with sociopathic satisfaction. "That is dangerous." The word dropped like a judge's gavel. The group dynamic instantly morphed from idle curiosity into predatory mobilization. The life lesson here is simple but brutal. Toxic systems do not tolerate anomalies. They view any unapproved secret as a direct threat to their authority that absolutely must be neutralized. The child was no longer just a biological fact. It was a volatile symbol of defiance. Brandon's jaw clenched. He took a deliberate step forward, using physical mass to shrink her escape routes. "Who is it?" he demanded softly. "As an analyst, I find a quiet threat far more indicative of lethal intent than a loud one. Who did you move on with?" The question was designed to induce cognitive overload. Maddie was boxed in, suffocating, under the collective scrutiny of the room. Yet, instead of regressing into the compliant shell of Stockholm Syndrome, she did something remarkable. She lifted her chin and maintained eye contact with a clinical calm. Anger is an emotion a narcissist can easily manipulate. Total, unbothered detachment is the one response that renders them entirely powerless. "I did not move on," Maddie said, her voice completely devoid of panic. "I moved away." Those words were devastating because they were the objective truth. In the criminal mind, truth is a highly destabilizing pathogen. Savannah's rigid mask slipped for a micro-expression, exposing her underlying panic. Brandon's pupils dilated as the illusion of his control shattered behind his eyes. Maddie finally saw the entire board. This attack was not about her humiliation. It was a desperate scramble for power. The secret she carried was the ultimate variable they could not solve. "Stick with me here, because This is where the healing begins. Maddie realized that once the true origin of her child was brought into the light, the psychological hierarchy of these abusers would permanently collapse. The resulting silence was vibrating with kinetic threat. Brandon's facial micro-movements betrayed a profound loss of emotional regulation. His shoulders locked, and the physical space between them collapsed as he tried to dominate her visually. Savannah immediately recognized that the narcissistic's supply was failing. She pivoted sharply to recapture the narrative. Moved away, she mocked gently. From what exactly? Responsibility, or just the consequences of your choices? Let us dissect this technique. It is called narrative reframing. Savannah was manipulating the audience, planting the idea that Maddie was not a survivor fleeing an abuser, but a coward dodging accountability. It was a highly calculated strike designed to strip the victim of her credibility right in front of the jury. Brandon breached her final boundary, stepping so near that his cologne invaded her system. Scent is the fastest route to the brain's trauma center, and he weaponized it to drag her back to the past. "You do not get to rewrite what happened," he whispered. The hostility in his throat proved this was a desperate bid to re-establish his behavioral dominance. "You walked away without a word," he hissed, demanding an explanation she did not owe him. His gaze dropped back to her stomach, utterly repulsed by the physical evidence of her freedom. He could not process that she had escaped his psychological cage. To a megalomaniac, a victim successfully building a new life is the ultimate insult. It completely shatters their fragile delusion of absolute supremacy and godlike control. Maddie absorbed the heavy toxicity of his stare, yet her feet remained planted. Overcoming trauma requires tremendous neurological rewiring, and she refused to surrender her hard-earned baseline. But before the interaction could escalate into physical violence, the environmental chemistry of the room abruptly changed. A new subject entered her blind spot. I always tell my students to watch how a group reacts to an apex predator. It is never loud. The chatter simply evaporated. The audience's biological focus violently snapped away from Brandon and locked onto the new arrival without a single verbal command. Authentic, lethal power does not need to yell for attention. It simply occupies space, and the nervous systems of every single person in the vicinity automatically recalibrate. A voice vibrated just over Maddie's shoulder. "That is enough." The pitch was low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. Those 3 words surgically dismantled the crisis. Maddie felt his presence, acting as a grounding mechanism, stabilizing her elevated heart rate before she even confirmed his identity. When she turned, she did not look at him with fear, but with the profound recognition of true danger. Colton Hale did not rush the center to posture like an amateur. He stepped perfectly into her peripheral zone. He aligned his body with hers, claiming an undeniable biological perimeter, yet leaving enough distance to monitor the exits. It was a masterclass in spatial dominance. He effectively built a physical fortress around her without having to throw a single punch. Colton stood relaxed, but his central nervous system was utterly primed for execution. He glanced briefly from Maddie to Brandon, and in that microsecond, the entire hierarchy of the room inverted. Brandon tried to hide his physiological response, but his jaw clamped tight. A rapid flicker of primal panic crossed his face before he forced a rigid mask back into place. "And you are?" Brandon challenged, but the tonal confidence was hollow. Stripped of its former megalomaniacal, Colton did not answer. He let the silence drag, turning Brandon's demand into an act of profound embarrassment. "We are going to look at this together and realize the truth." Colton weaponized silence to let the room identify him. Real authority is a heavy shadow. Once it falls over you, there is nowhere left to hide. Let's open this case file together, you and I. Observe the female aggressor, Savannah. Her eyes narrow as her baseline confidence fractures. In clinical terms, we are watching a predator recalibrate when the prey no longer acts afraid. She attempts to reassert dominance, claiming she did not invite an audience. But notice the male subject, Colton. He presents a fascinating counter-variable. Without raising his voice, he states she didn't earn the right to continue. It is the quiet authority of an apex element neutralizing a threat. For our subject, Maddie, this creates an acute psychological shift. The classic trauma response that's suffocating paralysis begins to fracture, letting in a single, vital ray of psychological autonomy. Prior to this variable, Maddie had locked into a defensive crouch, bracing for the inevitable psychological impact of her abuser. But now, the environmental stressors have fundamentally changed. Colton is simply present, steadying her without attempting to exert new control. We often see this in victims of severe manipulation. The sheer shock of experiencing a safe presence eases the physical compression in the chest. Beside them, Brandon exhibits the classic confusion of the megalomaniac narcissist. He exhales sharply, his brain struggling to process interference. He tells Colton he is inserting himself into private affairs, but the accusation lacks its usual venom. He is losing his grip on the diagnostic narrative. Colton's response is a perfect example of psychological neutralization. He states calmly that it concerns him because it concerns her. He does not posture, he does not escalate. The simplicity of the statement acts as a hammer against the fragile architecture of Brandon's control, instantly silencing Savannah's secondary aggression. For Maddie, standing between the ghost of her abuser and this new stabilizing force, a profound cognitive restructuring occurs. She realizes the abuse is no longer happening to her, it is happening around her. You see, the defining trait of a trauma bond is the belief in your own powerlessness. But right here, in this exact second, she understands she is no longer the weakest organism in the room. When power shifts in a confined social environment, you and I know the resulting tremor is palpable to anyone trained to observe danger. Savannah's reaction is deeply Machiavellian. Her smile does not fade, but tightens. She immediately begins recalculating her strategy, attempting to salvage a game she's assumed she was already winning. She is a secondary parasite adapting to a new host environment. Brandon, however, cannot mask his physiological response. He hesitates. His pupils contract. This is not mere irritation we are witnessing. It is the acute, terrifying recognition that a stronger entity has entered his territory. His entire identity is built on absolute control, and Colton's sheer existence is an existential threat to that delusion. We must understand that a true megalomaniac narcissist like Brandon never retreats from a perceived challenge to his ego. It simply is not in his behavioral programming. Watch how he forces his breathing to slow, artificially manufacturing composure. His focus snaps back to Maddie, sharper and more vicious, driven by the pathological need to dominate the object he believes is his property. He lowers his voice, a tactic designed to simulate danger. He accuses her of disappearing only to return with a proxy to speak for her. The implication is mathematically precise in its cruelty. It is designed to strip her of agency, projecting his own toxic narrative into the silence of the room, demanding she submit to the old paradigm. Let us examine the accomplice's role. Savannah seizes the silence with predatory precision. She softens her expression into a mask of synthetic sympathy. Though her micro-expressions betray pureness, she notes the hidden pregnancy, and the presence of a male protector, claiming this explains everything. For Maddie, this accusation triggers a familiar, suffocating pressure. In the primitive psychology of their social circle, a vulnerable woman standing beside a dominant male is not viewed as protected or safe. She is perceived as claimed, owned by a new master. It is a vicious reframing designed to exploit the lingering effects of her Stockholm syndrome, making her question her own hard-won autonomy and worth. That specific, toxic narrative has the potential to be far more damaging than any of Brandon's direct attacks. I want you to notice Maddie's immediate physiological response. Her fingers tighten against her coat. Her nervousness reacts before her frontal lobe can process the threat. But watch closely. She forces herself to remain still. She regulates her breathing. She refuses to let their pathology define her reality anymore. She has spent years as a moldable object in their delusions, and she is finally rejecting the cast. Brandon's eyes darken as he observes this resistance. The baseline curiosity morphs into a restless, predatory agitation. He tightens his vocal cords and demands an answer, escalating the pressure. Who is the father? The question is deployed not as an inquiry, but as a blunt instrument of trauma. It carries the weight of a calculated interrogation, heightened by the presence of onlookers who will catalogue every tremor of her response. Savannah tilts her head, displaying the classic somatic markers maze of a sadist enjoying the extraction of pain. She purrs that they all deserve to know, using the concept of bloodlines as a mechanism of social control. The physical space in the room seems to compress. The silence transforms into a suffocating collective demand. You and I have seen this in interrogations, the environmental pressure designed to force a confession, to strip the subject of all psychological defenses. But Maddie cannot simply offer the truth. The variables at play here are far too volatile. Her secret does not belong in this sterile, hostile environment, nor does it belong to these meg-fractured personalities. Before she can deploy either silence or active defiance as a countermeasure, Savannah executes a textbook character assassination. She steps into Maddie's intimate zone and asks if she is quiet, because she simply does not know who the father is. It is a brilliant, entirely malevolent social grenade. The accusation drops like a lit match into highly combustible fumes. We immediately observe the contagion effect in the room, curiosity mutating into a dark, judgmental murmur. The pack is turning on the isolated target. In closed social systems, an insinuation requires zero empirical proof to be accepted as absolute fact by those starved for a scapegoat. Colton's behavioral response to this is subtle but deeply significant. He shifts his stance just enough to communicate that a hard boundary has been breached. He locks his gaze onto Savannah with the flat, dead-eyed stare of a true apex predator. He warns her that she is stepping into territory she does not comprehend. It is not a threat. It is a clinical observation of her impending ruin. Savannah's synthetic smile flickers. We see the first genuine crack in her narcissistic armor. She insists she understands perfectly, but the pitch of her voice betrays a sudden spike in cortisol. She insists that secrets inevitably surface, a desperate attempt to maintain control. Brandon's jaw clenches, his attention snapping violently back to Maddie. Savannah's provocation has triggered his absolute need for dominance. He tells Maddie she owes them an explanation, his voice dropping into that familiar, hypnotic cadence of the abuser. This is the exact frequency that built her Stockholm syndrome. For a terrifying microsecond, the neurological pathways of her past trauma threaten to pull her back into the dark. But then, the anchor holds. The steady, quiet presence of Colton beside her interrupts the conditioned response. He does not try to manage her or control her. He simply exists in the space as a safe harbor. This brings us to a crucial life lesson. We often mistake the absence of pain for healing, but true recovery is the ability to stand in the room with the source of your trauma and feel absolutely nothing. Maddie lifts her chin, her voice slicing through the psychological static of the room. She tells him she owes him nothing. It is a flawless assertion of boundaries. Brandon experiences immediate cognitive dissonance. His facial muscles spasm as he looks at a version of his victim that his megalomaniac, narcissist brain cannot process. Savannah's irritation bleeds through her slipping mask. Beside them, Colton maintains absolute silence. In behavioral warfare, holding silence after a boundary is set is the ultimate display of power. Let us look at the fallout together, you and I. The environmental tension does not dissipate. It compresses, humming like a garrote wire pulled to the breaking point. Brandon's eyes fixate on Maddie with a terrifying intensity. This is no longer about his fabricated concern. This is the raw panic of an abuser, feeling his absolute control slipping through his fingers like sand. He is entirely unaccustomed to denial, and her quiet certainty fractures his reality more violently than screaming ever could. For a fraction of a second, his baseline aggression surges, suggesting imminent physical escalation. But then, a terrifying micro-expression flashes across his features. A new, far more dangerous calculus has just formed in his mind. Let's examine this baseline deviation together. Brandon's gaze disconnected, not in retreat, but in rapid, silent recalculation. He was scanning the room, drowning in a memory that fractured his current reality. Savannah, showing the hyper-vigilance of a controlling personality, detected this shift instantly. The rigid jaw, the inward collapse of his certainty, her fingers clamped onto his arm. This was not an embrace. It was a tactile restraint, a physical reinforcement of the psychological cage she had built. "What is it?" she probed, but laced with sudden paranoia. Brandon withheld his verbal response. Instead, his focus drifted back to Maddie, locking heavily onto the undeniable truth hidden beneath her winter coat. When cognitive dissonance finally shatters, the psychological fallout is instantaneous. "We came here for a reason," Brandon stated, his voice slicing through the heavy atmosphere. It was a verbal anchor, a desperate attempt to ground his spiraling psyche. Savannah's mask slipped. A microscopic blink. For the first time, the manipulator was completely off balance. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her carefully modulated tone failing to hide the sudden strain. Brandon exhaled a sharp breath, raking his hand through his hair in a classic self-soothing gesture of severe emotional agitation. "The air preparations," he blurted out. The raw, unfiltered truth escaped his lips entirely before his conscious mind could censor the devastating damage. The physiological reaction was instantaneous. Savannah's fingers dug into his arm like a vice. This was no longer about subtle control. It was an aggressive restraint designed to violently snap his focus back to her. "The what?" she demanded. Her pitch dropped, abandoning the socially acceptable persona she had weaponized against Maddie. The boutique had been her designated theater for psychological torture, but the power dynamic had instantly inverted. Brandon froze. It was only a fraction of a second, but in our field, a micro-hesitation is a full confession. "You said we were browsing," she continued. Her voice was terrifyingly low, vibrating with the raw tremor of a narcissist realizing they have lost the upper hand. "You said it was not serious yet." The symbiotic alliance between them ruptured. For the first time ever, Savannah displayed genuine psychological instability, watching, make her meticulously engineered narrative disintegrate. Here is a simple truth you and I must remember. Absolute control is merely a fragile illusion we to when we fear reality. Brandon's guy's gaze darted frantically between her and Maddie. His emotional armor was dissolving into raw, primitive panic. "Savannah, not here," he muttered, but the psychological damage was irreversible. The profound weight of his admission hung in the tense room. Hair preparations were never casual variables. They were absolute commitments, deeply rooted in the ruthless, primal obsession with legacy, bloodlines, and generational dominance. The psychological focus of the room shifted instantly. The question was no longer about Maddie's child, but the hidden motives driving Brandon's erratic presence. Beside Maddie, Colton maintained a baseline of absolute calm. He adjusted with the quiet awareness of an apex predator who knows that true dominance requires zero intervention. He simply watched the mental fracture widen in real time. Savannah physically recoiled. Her hand dropped from Brandon's arm, the physical contact suddenly repulsive to her nervous system. "You lied to me," she stated. The calculated smoothness was completely gone from her voice. In its place was something volatile, the terrifying, unfiltered emotional exposure of a controlling personality who has just been publicly deceived. Brandon's jaw locked as his executive control rapidly degraded. "I did not lie," he snapped. "In our line of work, an aggressive denial is always a direct confirmation of guilt. I just did not explain everything," he rationalized. "That is the same thing," Savannah fired back. Her rigid composure shattered, exposing a deep core of pure rage. This was a catastrophic deviation from her carefully mapped reality. Across the room, Maddie stood perfectly still. The suffocating psychological pressure had finally transferred away from her, allowing her nervous system to regulate. But beneath her temporary relief, a much colder, sharper realization took root. Brandon's verbal slip was not just a simple deception. It was a chilling window into a far more dangerous hidden agenda. It was a clinical exposure of hidden motive, the exact kind of psychological rupture I have observed in maximum security wards when a dominant inmate's constructed reality collapses. In their predatory environment, accidents simply do not exist. Colton shattered the baseline of the room with a voice that was eerily calm, stating that Brandon had far bigger problems than her. This was the classic unraveling of a megalomaniac narcissist. Brandon had buried a secret, and now the psychological ground beneath him was fracturing. The tension spread like a cold contagion. Savannah, whose rigid posture had previously signaled absolute control, suddenly displayed the erratic edges of a co-conspirator losing her grip. Her flawless mask shattered into pure paranoia. Savannah shifted her predatory focus entirely away from Maddie and locked onto Brandon. "Today, you and I are going to unpack this specific mechanism together. It is the moment the enabler realizes the narcissist is a sinking ship." Brandon found himself trapped between two collapsing fronts, his authority eroding in real time as his ego desperately tried to maintain dominance over both women. Meanwhile, Maddie remained isolated in the center of the blast radius. Her body, burdened by the child she carried, began to physically manifest the ambient trauma. This is a common somatic response to severe psychological distress. A deep tightening started low in her abdomen, a silent warning from a nervous system pushed to its absolute limit by unrelenting pressure. She shifted her weight, a deeply ingrained survival reflex, pressing her hand against her side beneath her coat. Her breathing altered, betraying her physical distress to anyone trained to read human biology under extreme duress. Colton possessed that exact training. He required no verbal confirmation. His focus narrowed with the terrifying precision of a seasoned operative tuning out the surrounding chaos completely. He ordered her to look at him, providing a firm psychological tether to ground her dissociative state. She tried to comply, but a second physiological wave hit her, stronger and brutally insistent. It hovered on the razor edge of severe trauma. Cutting through this delicate clinical moment, Savannah demanded to know what was wrong with her. Savannah's question was completely devoid of human empathy, laced instead with sharp irritation. To her, Maddie's physical suffering was merely a logistical inconvenience, disrupting her attempt to regain psychological dominance. Brandon finally turned his attention back to his victim. He stepped forward with a flicker of what might look like concern to an untrained eye, but it was heavily contaminated by frustration and dark, possessive entitlement. He asked if she was okay, reaching for the control he was rapidly losing. But his movement was instantly neutralized. Colton smoothly inserted himself into the negative space between them. He became an immovable physical boundary, an absolute barrier establishing dominance without ever needing to raise his voice. Colton stated that she needed space, his tone clinically detached but entirely final. It left absolutely zero oxygen for debate. Brandon's facial muscles tightened with rage, his narcissistic instincts violently rejecting the boundary, even as Colton's sheer physical authority forced him to freeze. He snapped that he was not talking to him, claiming Colton had no right to decide. But Colton held his ground, unblinking, simply stating that he already had. In behavioral science, we learn a simple, meaningful truth. True power never has to shout to prove it exists. While the men engaged in this silent war of dominance, Maddie's breathing slowed. She fought to anchor her spiraling nervous system, gripping a nearby display to physically ground her reality. The clinical environment around Maddie began to distort, the edges of the room blurring as her brain struggled to process the dual assault of physiological trauma and emotional devastation. This was the exact opposite of her escape plan. She had calculated a quiet extraction, a total severance of the Stockholm Syndrome that had tethered her to a monster. Instead, the psychological gravity of her captor was pulling her right back into the center of the nightmare. A third, violent wave of pain struck her, forcing a raw gasp from her lungs before she could suppress it. That breaking point triggered immediate action. Colton shifted his posture, reading the critical danger. He stated they were not staying here, seizing absolute control with chilling calm. Colton's hand lingered near her arm, a calculated gesture of proximity without boundary violation. "You need to sit down." Maddie's voice trembled slightly as she responded. "I'm fine," she managed, though her somatic tremors betrayed the false projection of strength. "You and I frequently see this, the physiological collapse, overriding psychological denial." Brandon advanced, his narcissistic equilibrium threatened. "She doesn't look fine," he snapped. Colton intervened, his tone weaponized but calm. "If something's wrong, then you've already made it worse," he stated. The assertion paralyzed Brandon, weaponizing his own guilt against him in a way he could not deny. Savannah, exhibiting a typical restraint, remained completely silent. Savannah observed the shifting dynamic, her previous grandiosity replaced by the cold, predatory calculation of a sociopath re-evaluating her prey. This was no longer a mere behavioral clash. The psychological underpinnings had shifted into deeper territory. Maddie forced her spine into a rigid posture, attempting to regulate her autonomic nervous system. The acute panic subsided into a chronic vigilance, a physiological reminder of the child she carried. In my practice, I have noted that motherhood often overrides conditioned victimhood. Every stressor was now a shared biological event. Colton observed her, his affect shifting from protective hostility to a grounded, stabilizing presence. We learn from such interactions that true emotional support requires absolute, unwavering presence. "You don't have to stand through this," Colton whispered, his low vocal frequency grounding her amygdala, short-circuiting the panic. For the first time, Maddie conceptualized escape not as a failure, but as an autonomous choice. Behind her, Brandon exhibited the physiological freezing of a megalomaniac losing his grip on reality. His perceived authority was disintegrating in real time through cracks he could no longer seal. Beyond the immediate conflict, the collective psyche of the room was mutating. A bruised ego is volatile, but something far more malignant was taking root beneath their social veneer. The life lesson here is stark. When a victim finally stops playing their assigned role, the entire systemic structure of abuse is forced to collapse in on itself completely. The clinical variables had bypassed mere social reputation, anchoring themselves to the biological reality of the child she carried. In criminal networks where power dictates survival, such a variable disrupts the established hierarchy. Let us examine this moment together. The psychological tension reached its critical mass and fractured, not through physical aggression, but through the eruption of repressed facts. Brandon's pathological composure finally shattered. The cognitive dissonance he harbored was violently resolving itself. He no longer viewed Maddie as a submissive object to manipulate, but as an undeniable reality outside of his control. We must understand that a narcissist's deepest terror is not physical defeat, but the sudden inability to author their own reality. The behavioral deviation was microscopic, yet catastrophic in an environment hyper-attuned to dominance. Savannah detected the shift immediately, her predatory instincts overriding her superficial charm. "What aren't you saying?" she demanded, her vocal effect entirely stripped of its theatrical polish. It was a raw, aggressive interrogation. Brandon expelled a breath, his hand dragging through his hair in a classic self-soothing mechanism that completely failed to regulate his spiking anxiety. "This isn't the place," he muttered. Yet his visual fixation returned to Maddie, anchored by a subconscious realization he could no longer compartmentalize. The human mind, no matter how deeply conditioned to deceive, will inevitably betray itself when its foundational delusion fractures. Colton maintained absolute silence, an effective clinical technique. By refusing to fill the conversational void, he created an unbearable psychological vacuum that forced the repressed material to surface. Maddie registered this atmospheric pressure. The concealed data she had safeguarded was being extracted, catalyzed entirely by the structural failure of Brandon's ego. Savannah invaded Brandon's physical space, her own emotional regulation failing rapidly. "You're reacting like you know something," she stated, searching his face. "Something you haven't told me." The accusation landed hard. If there is a lesson here, it is that silence is a heavier weapon than speech. When you remove the noise of defense, the guilty will invariably interrogate themselves until they finally shatter. The unresolved tension suspended itself over the group, an intellectual imperative requiring immediate resolution. Brandon swallowed hard, his mandible locked in physical resistance as he fixated on Maddie's abdomen. The clinical projection of suspicion was gone, replaced by profound cognitive dissonance. "I didn't think," he began, then stopped abruptly. "I didn't think this was possible." The incomplete data instantly magnetized the attention of every present observer. Maddie absorbed his confession without a spike in cortisol. It was pure recognition. She understood the pathology of his denial. You see, the architecture of a lie is inherently unstable. No matter how meticulously a sociopath constructs a false reality, undeniable truth will always breach the outer perimeter. Yet, anticipating a psychological collapse and actually observing it are vastly different experiences. Savannah's threshold for ambiguity evaporated entirely. "What does that mean?" she demanded, her social conditioning crumbling under the weight of her escalating paranoia. "What isn't possible?" Brandon executed a slow blink, a desperate neurological bid to reset his spiraling panic. When his eyelids parted, the megalomaniacal mask was obliterated. "I can't have children," he stated. The admission was a localized psychological explosive. The environment did not devolve into auditory chaos. Rather, a profound, suffocating silence descended. True, devastating revelations rarely arrive with screaming. They arrive with a suffocating stillness, where all previous delusions are incinerated. Savannah stared, her cognitive processing stalling as the foundational narrative of her existence was invalidated. "What?" she whispered. The acoustic footprint minimal, but the psychological impact catastrophic. Brandon maintained unbroken visual contact with Maddie, seeking external validation to stabilize his fractured ego. "I found out before I left," he confessed. "The tests, they weren't inconclusive." His jaw tightened under the severe injury of public exposure. "I thought it was better to walk away than to stay and let you realize it was my fault." He rationalized his abandonment as an act of protection. We must remember that a manipulator will always reframe their sheer cowardice as a noble sacrifice to avoid the agonizing sting of their own inadequacy. Let us unpack this dynamic together. Brandon displayed micro-expressions of remorse, an irrelevant data point at this terminal stage. Maddie's respiration hitched, a somatic release triggered by the validation of her reality. For months, she had endured the psychological torture of his gaslighting, internalizing his projected inadequacies until her own perception of truth warped. Hearing the empirical facts vocalized initiated a rapid cognitive realignment. A profound psychological burden dissipated despite the escalating environmental threat. Savannah retreated physically, her emotional regulation decimated. "So, you let her believe she was the problem?" she asked. The realization hit her with the cold brutality that only a fellow manipulative personality can truly appreciate. "You built everything on a lie just to protect yourself." Savannah correctly diagnosed his methodology. He had constructed a false reality to shield his fragile ego. Brandon exhibited a startled response. Colton intervened, his vocal tone exhibiting the unyielding stability of a neutral observer. "And now, you're standing here, accusing her of something that was never hers to carry," he said. "That's not just a mistake. That's a choice." This diagnostic clarity served as the final psychological verdict. Stripped of his delusions, Brandon was rendered completely mute. The core dynamic had violently shifted. The primary investigation was no longer about establishing paternity. The variables had mutated into something infinitely more lethal and highly unstable for everyone involved. If the established suspect was biologically excluded, a new, far more dangerous unknown was introduced into the equation. Truth in a closed, systemic environment behaves like a highly combustible agent. Brandon's confession had dissolved the megalomaniacal armor he had spent years fabricating. Yet, this was merely the preliminary phase of the psychological collapse. Savannah exhibited brief catatonia, her respiration shallow as her prefrontal cortex desperately attempted to integrate this conflicting data. She was reviewing her behavioral history, reassessing every manipulation she had engineered. Then, a distinct micro-expression registered on her face. The confusion evaporated into sudden, chilling clarity. It is deeply terrifying how rapidly a seasoned predator can adapt to a new paradigm. It was the cognitive closure that occurs when a sociopath finally identifies the hidden leverage. Her visual focus locked onto Maddie with predatory intensity, analyzing her somatic baseline for confirmation. "So that's why," she murmured, her vocal frequency dropping into a lethal, controlled register. Brandon re-engaged, his anxiety manifesting in physical rigidity. "Why?" "What?" he demanded. Savannah utterly dismissed his presence as a neutralized asset. Her entire psychological apparatus was now fixated on Maddie and the massive imbalance of power this secret represented. "You didn't tell him," Savannah continued. Her tone abandoned its mockery, settling into cold realization. Knowledge, especially the hidden kind, is the absolute ultimate currency of psychological control. Let us examine the psychological shift in the room. Savannah's words no longer functioned as a mere insult. They became a clinical observation, which is infinitely more dangerous. Ma's nervous system reacted instantly. Her fingers gripped her coat, a classic self-soothing mechanism, not born of simple fear, but of the realization that her camouflage was failing. Someone was unearthing the suppressed variable. Beside her, Brandon exhibited signs of acute narcissistic collapse. His cognitive dissonance fractured his control. He demanded clarity with a frantic tone, attempting to violently force reality back into his rigid paradigm. The lesson here is simple. Control is merely an illusion we cling to until some smarter enters the room. Brandon asked what she was implying, his tone vibrating with pathological desperation. Savannah exhaled, her sociopathic focus sharpening into something deliberate and unpolished. "I am implying," she stated with surgical precision, "that this is not a random variable. This child is a calculated decision. You and I have seen this in maximum security wards the exact moment the narrative pivots from an accidental tragedy to premeditated intent." The atmospheric pressure in the room altered completely. This was no longer a trivial scandal to be managed. It was a strategic maneuver. Colton remained physically anchored beside Maddie, yet his posture tightened into the quiet, predatory alertness of a protector anticipating a threat. We learn quickly that true danger never announces itself loudly. Colton had been cataloging every microscopic shift in the room now, his focus locked onto Savannah with the chilling precision of an apex predator. "Be careful," he instructed quietly. His tone carried a lethal warning disguised beneath a flat affect. Savannah offered a micro-expression of a smile, utterly devoid of empathy or warmth. She possessed the absolute certainty of an investigator cracking a difficult subject. "I understand far more than you realize," she countered, her voice dropping into a hypnotic register. She advanced slowly, analyzing Maddie. "You were always so quiet," she mused, excavating memories she had previously discarded. Observation teaches us a fundamental truth. The quietest individuals in any given room are always the ones gathering the most ammunition. "Everyone misdiagnosed you as compliant," Savannah continued, identifying the profound Stockholm syndrome that others mistook for weakness. "But you were conducting your own surveillance." Maddie's respiration slowed. This was a parasympathetic response to intense, unavoidable focus. Savannah was no longer projecting blind hypotheses. She was constructing a factual timeline. Brandon's facial muscles contorted in profound confusion, his megalomania blinding him to his own blind spots. "What are you talking about?" he pleaded, his authoritarian mask dissolving into pathetic irrelevance. Savannah ignored him entirely. "I am talking about the fact that she knew," Savannah finalized. "She knew you were entirely incapable of producing an heir. The truth always dismantles the loudest ego first." The psychological impact of those words was immediate. Brandon's attention violently redirected to Maddie, his eyes wide with frantic, disorganized attachment. Maddie simply maintained eye contact, utilizing a weaponized silence that confirmed every suspicion. Savannah's neural pathways continued to fire rapidly, synthesizing the final variables. "And if she knew about your condition," Savannah articulated with measured cruelty, "then she understood the precise devastation this would cause. She knew the trauma this would inflict upon the entire fragile power structure you built. This concealed pregnancy was a calculated strike. If we look closely, we see that the deepest psychological wounds are always inflicted by those who have quietly studied our vulnerabilities." "No," Brandon vocalized, though the auditory weakness in his denial revealed his internal collapse. He could not reconcile this tactical betrayal with his submissive model of her, yet the cognitive dissonance was already tearing at his foundational beliefs. Beside them, Colton exhibited zero baseline deviations. His heart rate appeared steady, his posture relaxed. However, in the realm of criminal pathology, a lack of reaction is the most profound reaction of all. He offered no correction, and that silence functioned as an admission of guilt. Savannah caught the discrepancy immediately. "You and I know that the most dangerous detail is often the one left unspoken." Unless, Savannah hypothesized, stretching the syllable to maximize the psychological tension in the room. Unless this was never a solitary operation, Savannah concluded. The auditory environment flatlined. The diagnostic parameters of the crisis had violently shifted. The inquiry was no longer focused on maternal deception, but on identifying the apex predator, providing her systemic protection. The silence stretching between them was suffocating, thick with the adrenaline of a severe threat response. It was the clinical pause right before a total structural collapse. Yet, internally, Maddie's biometric markers stabilized. Deep within her psyche, beneath the extensive trauma bonding and chronic hypervigilance she had endured for years, a profound neurological clarity emerged. True liberation only begins the moment we stop fearing the consequences of our own survival. The underlying reality had been orbiting this exact confrontation for months, obscured by elaborate defense mechanisms and geographical distance. But denial has a definitive expiration date. Savannah's visual focus locked directly onto Colton with the devastating accuracy of a ballistics trajectory. She was no longer processing hypotheses. She had isolated the primary variable. "It is you," she stated. The declaration was devoid of theatricality. It was delivered with the chilling satisfaction of completing a complex psychological profile. Brandon's cranium jerked toward Colton, his facial geometry twisting into a grotesque mask of paranoid rejection. "That is statistically impossible," he stammered, fighting desperately against a truth that was already dissecting him alive. His protest possessed zero structural integrity. Deep within the architecture of his narcissistic delusion, the data had already aligned. Colton did not deploy an immediate countermeasure. He refrained from physical escalation or vocal dominance, entirely rejecting the hysterical management tactics Brandon relied upon. He merely existed in the space, radiating a baseline composure that severely destabilized the others. His eyes shifted momentarily to Maddie. It was not a request for validation, but a psychological tether. grounding her in an environment that had passed the point of no return. Sometimes, the most commanding presence is the one that refuses to react. Savannah exhaled a measured breath, her cognitive machinery adapting to this new, incredibly lethal reality. A cold, clinical comprehension settled over Savannah. "Of course," she murmured, her facial muscles contracting into a humorless phantom of a smile. This revelation explained the anomaly in his behavioral data. "That is why you never exhibited a stress response. That is why your baseline has remained perfectly suppressed. You and I must analyze this tactic carefully. Total emotional regulation in a crisis almost always indicates prior knowledge." "You already knew," she concluded. Brandon stumbled backward, experiencing a profound loss of equilibrium. The psychological scaffolding of his reality was collapsing in real time. "You are attempting to tell me," he stammered, his vocal cords constricting under immense stress. His brain simply refused to process the final date point. Maddie absorbed the shifting atmospheric dynamics. She had clinically predicted a volatile detonation, expecting the trauma bonds to violently sever. Instead, the revelation manifested as an absolute, paralyzing certainty. Her autonomic nervous system regulated. She elevated her chin, adjusting her posture to signal pure agency. "He did not acquire this intelligence today," she articulated, maintaining a direct, unwavering visual lock on Brandon. "He has been aware." Those syllables inflicted catastrophic psychological damage. Brandon's superficial charm and rigid authoritarian facade disintegrated completely, leaving behind nothing but the terrified core of a deeply inadequate man. "You knew," he repeated to Colton, his voice stripped of all its former megalomaniacal power. "You were aware of this metric the entire time." Colton did not exhibit a single micro-flinch. "I was," he confirmed with brutal efficiency. The sheer absence of justification in his response proved far more devastating than any elaborate defense mechanism. "Let us evaluate Savannah's reaction together." She inhaled precisely, her prefrontal cortex rapidly calculating the power differential and the impending collateral damage. "Then, this biological development is not merely a child," she deduced, her gaze functioning like a scalpel as it sliced between them. "It is a territorial claim." In their framework, genetics functioned as currency and dominance. Colton's facial geometry remained static, but his musculature hardened into an undeniable posture of lethal ownership. "It is not a strategic claim," Colton corrected with chilling tranquility. "It is a biological imperative, a future." His pupils tracked briefly to Maddie, softening for a fraction of a millisecond before hardening into obsidian as he re-engaged the others. "And it is a future that neither of you possess the clearance to disrupt." The absolute finality of his tone functioned as a psychological guillotine. Brandon was paralyzed in a state of catatonic shock. The complex web of his manipulations, his profound narcissistic abuses, and his fundamental delusion of supremacy had all been incinerated. Savannah simply observed. Her survival instincts successfully overrode her ego, recognizing that this game was permanently concluded. True intelligence is knowing precisely when to quietly surrender. Let us examine this final moment together. Maddie exhaled, releasing the chronic tension that had paralyzed her nervous system. The physiological release was incomplete, as extreme trauma rarely evaporates overnight. But she was no longer a fractured subject trapped in a psychological cage. She stood at the edge of a profound cognitive shift, moving past mere survival. As she let Colton guide her away from the wreckage, we see a fascinating adaptation. Her victim narrative dissolves completely. "My clinical work has taught me one simple truth. A mind may shatter under targeted abuse, but when it rebuilds, it forms impenetrable armor. What walked out of that room was not a broken tragedy, but the birth of a dominant legacy her captors failed to anticipate.